The Children's Committee is coming back to order, and with that, we will adjourn. Now I'd like to call to order the public hearing. Hello, welcome back, everybody. And we will call our first person to testify in just a moment. Thank you. Stand at ease. We'd like to call, please, Sarah Egan, our child advocate, followed by Melanie Wild Lane and Andrew Feinstein. Thank you.
Good afternoon to the committee. My name is Sarah Egan. I run the state's Office of the Child Advocate, and we're here to testify on the bill regarding having the child advocate. I didn't put the number in my testimony. Believe that? On the bill requiring the child advocate to examine the policies and procedures of DCF. We appreciate there being a vehicle for this effort, because the OCA, as you know, has submitted a number of recommendations to the committee for consideration in what we think of as an omnibus bill to support the safety of children. And our testimony, which I hope you have, which I submitted last night, goes through some of the basis for those recommendations and what we think are some of the most pressing issues around child safety at the Department of Children and Families. I wanted to say at the outset, grateful for this opportunity to testify. Our recommendations to the committee are a recommendation to codify our findings and recommendations from our 2023 investigative report regarding the homicide death of 2-year-old Liam Rivera on or about December 29th, 2022. I also want to say that while the issues identified in Liam's fatality review and in Marcello Meadows' fatality review, which we issued a few weeks ago, are very serious. They are very urgent, very pressing. The OCA does remain in very constructive dialogue with the new commissioner of DCF. In fact, I met with her just this afternoon to talk about the very issues that we're going to be discussing here today. So I'm very pleased to report that, and I think we're making progress. We value the opportunity to develop solutions with state agency representatives and are committed to candid and constructive engagement with state officials. We do continue to recommend urgent effort to improve operations at DCF, most specifically to ensure the provision of consistent safety planning, service delivery, and case supervision in cases that involve children aged birth to 5, and a reliable quality assurance framework for case practice with these highest risk children. I just wanted to walk briefly through some of the facts of Liam's life and death, because I think they're very important and served as the basis for our recommendations. On or about the end of December 2022, 2-year-old Liam Rivera died due to injuries sustained from blunt force trauma. He was found by authorities buried in a park in Stamford, Connecticut. Both of his parents have been arrested on charges, but neither is charged with criminal responsibility for his death. Liam had an open case with DCF and the juvenile court at the time of his death and was living with his mother and a sibling, and likely, unbeknownst to authorities, his father. Liam had been removed from his parents' care as an infant due to findings of child abuse, and the court committed him to DCF's guardianship. He was later returned to his mother's care by DCF without notice or approval from the juvenile court through an informal agency practice known as placing children home under commitment. He lived with his mother in this informal custody arrangement for 6 months, during which time his parents violated the criminal court protective order pertaining to Liam. A police investigation ensued, and Liam's mother was charged with making a false statement to police. OCA found that DCF internal meetings discussing concerns about Liam's safety were not documented in the case record, nor were the concerns or protective order violation relayed in real time to the juvenile court. After several months of Liam being home under commitment, DCF filed legal paperwork informing the court that Liam had been living with his mother, that he was healthy and doing well, that there had been a protective order violation, that the concerns had been resolved, and requested that the court restore Liam's mother's custodial rights. The court approved of this recommendation and ordered 9 months of what's called protective supervision. Unbeknownst to the court, Liam's health and weight were already in precipitous decline, and he had lost weight since returning home from foster care. DCF had not obtained any medical records from Liam's providers and therefore provided the court with erroneous information. In October 2022, while Liam was still under protective supervision, Liam's pediatrician contacted DCF to convey concerns about Liam's weight and informed his caseworker that Liam was re-diagnosed as failure to thrive. The doctor noted Liam's normal development while he was in foster care. There was no further follow-up by assigned staff with the pediatrician, and Liam's mother did not bring him for a scheduled follow-up appointment in November. Liam was killed only a few weeks later, with 3 months remaining on the period of court-ordered supervision. He weighed only 17 pounds when he died, despite being 2.5 years old. The CDC says the 50th percentile for children Liam's age is 30 pounds. Liam's lawyer visited him only once in the year prior to Liam's death and did not seek updated records from the department or Liam's medical provider at any time following Liam's return home. While DCF conducted visitation with the family twice monthly per the agency's minimum standards and made referrals to parenting services, OCA's investigation found that staff did not adhere to agency rules or expectations in a variety of ways. Our testimony goes through them, so I won't read them here today. But in sum, what we were concerned about were informal practices that happened outside the court's purview to return a child that had been abused and neglected home with a parent, and a failure to obtain and update regular information about the child by assigned staff, and therefore the failure to provide accurate and complete information to the court. Regarding Liam's lawyer, for those that don't know, any child that is the subject of an abuse neglect petition filed in the juvenile court is assigned a state-appointed lawyer that comes through the Office of the Chief Public Defender. In this report, OCA found that Liam's assigned counsel, who was counsel just for him and his sibling, did not meet any of the state and federal law or contractual expectations for the representation of children in abuse neglect proceedings. And this is not the first report that OCA has issued that has made this finding. It's one in a series of reports where we've made findings that children were not visited in accordance with expectations in federal law and contract, and where lawyer assigned for the child did not obtain basic information about the child's safety and well-being. I go through that because the only way to honor the terrible, tragic death of a child like Liam is to look at his death in the way the federal child death review professionals urge us to, as a sentinel event that must catalyze action. There is so much to learn from what happened to Liam, from what happened to Marcello, from what happened to baby Kaylee last year, who also died at 1 year old from fentanyl intoxication. It is our obligation to do that learning and to make those changes. And the recommendations that we offer this committee are consistent with the recommendations we made in Liam's report. One, on page 3 of our testimony, is to create parameters for DCF's use of extended trial home visits, and to create a notification process to the court and a plan for who is going to be responsible for what when a child is returned home from foster care. 2, the development of a public and accountable framework for disclosure of data and information by DCF regarding children's safety, permanency, and well-being. This is a resurrection of a recommendation we made last session, which we think is extremely important for the State Child Welfare Agency to have a public framework for the collection, dissemination, and disclosure of systems data regarding children's safety and well-being. I think they are in the process of developing that, but it is important that state law codify what those expectations are and have a process for identifying what those goals and data should be. I think it's important for me to convey to the committee that the issues we identified in Liam's fatality review, Kaylee's fatality review, and Marcello's fatality review are reflected back in the systems data that we have examined from DCF on the consistency or quality of their safety practice and case supervision across the board, which shows inconsistencies and challenges that must urgently be addressed. 3, creation of a legislative working group to develop recommendations that will improve the quality of legal representation for children in child protection proceedings. Our recommendation to improve that system harkens back to the report that we issued on the near death of Dallas Church in foster care, the death of Matthew Tirado, who also had an who died by homicide in 2017, and who was also represented in the weeks prior to his death. They're reiterated in multiple near fatality and fatality reviews that this office has conducted. The system of state-appointed lawyers for children must improve. There are many stakeholders to that discussion. We think it most appropriate to bring those stakeholders, including youth who have been represented, to the table in a working group to look at that system, say what's working about it and what isn't, and make recommendations to the legislature for improvement. 4, to bring the DCF statewide advisory committee into compliance with federal requirements for citizen review panels. So the DCF SAC is a citizen review panel within the meaning of state and federal law. It is filled with wonderful volunteers. They are not now in compliance with expectations under federal law, where they're supposed to issue an annual report regarding evaluating DCF's effectiveness at achieving its obligations around safety, permanency, and well-being. DCF is supposed to file a responsive report. It's also supposed to receive reports from facilities. This harkens back to our recommendation around the Star Homes and why I think it fits in there. It doesn't do those things now. We would also make recommendations to strengthen the membership, because currently the members of the SAC are all appointed by DCF and are under contract with DCF. Doesn't mean they don't have tremendous contributions, but there are other stakeholders that could be included in that body, and it is an important opportunity to do that. 5, require DCF to report to the juvenile court material information regarding the child's safety and well-being, and whether children's attorneys were notified of treatment plan meetings pertaining to the child. Require the court to canvass, meaning ask questions of, the child's appointed lawyer regarding the lawyer's obligations. This is a really important one. This just comes up time and time and time again, right? There are responsibilities that belong to DCF. There are responsibilities that belong to the juvenile court. We want to make sure that DCF is giving all material information to the court, and our recommendations and our language specify what that is, that the court is making specific findings, that information has been received, and that the court is canvassing the child's attorney about the child's attorney's obligation to have firsthand knowledge of the child's well-being through the acquisition of records and meeting with the child. So I just want to highlight, we think this recommendation is extremely important. And we are working with all of the agencies whose work is relevant to our recommendations. That includes the Office of the Chief Public Defender, DCF, and the judicial branch. And I think we are close to an agreement on a lot of the recommendations. And so really credit to my colleagues across agencies for looking at this as an opportunity to make important changes. Don't have complete agreement yet. We're rapidly trying to get that for all of you. But I think it's my job here to say that these recommendations are remedial. They are there to remedy systemic problems that we see, not just in Liam's case, but in other cases, frankly, that we're reviewing right now. So there are structures in place to support the safety and well-being of children, the lawyer, the court, the child welfare agency, even providers. So this is an opportunity to improve those systems to make sure that children like Liam don't fall through the cracks. Thank you for your review.
Thank you so much for coming before us and sharing all of your recommendations. I'm really heartened to hear that you're all working together to come to solutions. This is what we should be doing. Any questions for my co-chair, Representative Lennon?
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming here and going over your recommendations. And I'm going to echo my co-chair. Thank you so much for the work that you've been doing together, right? Because for some people who aren't aware, is that the co-chairs of this committee did ask that you sit down with DCF and find places that you can meet in the middle. And I think that I'm very happy to see that most of these say you are either in agreement or close to agreement. But I just want to focus right now item number 5. We didn't receive any testimony from the court regarding the best way to move through this. And when my co-chair and I were just brainstorming on how we can, what recommendations we can make that might get everybody to a point where we believe information will be shared um, without getting into moving too far outside of what DCF's call is, right? And I think correct me if I'm wrong, but that could be a little bit of a sticking point in this. And without hearing from the courts, but one of the things we discussed was within the case files to actually require that there be a checklist of items, and then a caseworker asked to actually click something within the database to say, okay, we sent this on this date. This was sent on that date. And then that would satisfy DCF, but there's nothing that we can see how we're going to satisfy making sure that the courts get this. And at what point is it too much to put into statute to ensure that the child's attorney reads it? I mean, the only thing we can be sure of is that information is shared. But I do not understand, and this is something that we've been trying to really work with. How do we ensure that someone is doing their job short of just the fact that we make sure that the information is getting to them? I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, so I think we're very close to agreement on, oh, and as of my filing this, the judicial branch is on board with the language that we have. So that's hot off the press.
This is exciting.
That's very
I love that
exciting.
there's agreement.
Yes.
Okay.
It's very good. And all credit to my colleague, Christina, and our colleagues at the branch who've been working closely on that language. And I think it's intricate, but it's sort of 3 parts, right? So just to give you one example, the federal law requires that for a child under state care and supervision that, and I'm just quoting from memory, right? But that the department, the Child Welfare Agency, maintain and keep up to date information about their medical, emotional, mental health, right? So that's part of why the agency has policies that say on a monthly basis, you have to check with the make collateral contacts, check with the doctor, check with the mental health provider, check with whoever's working with the child, and then make sure that your file is up to date, right? So that happens sometimes. It doesn't happen other times. It didn't happen for Liam, right? And because of that, right, people didn't know that the minute he went home from foster care, he began to lose weight, even at like 16, 17 months old, right? And that trajectory continued until he died. So just compliance with that provision, right, could have been potentially life-saving for him because folks would have seen that. They would have studied what's going on, why is this happening? It would have been assessed, et cetera, right? So what our recommendation is calling for is that information, right? When department is providing information to the court in its studies and its report, how the child's doing, that it is including that information, from the child's providers, right? And that the court is then making the corresponding findings about the child's health and well-being, and that the lawyer is being canvassed about, and some of this happens now, right? So it's not all new, right? So the lawyer then gets canvassed about, have you met with your child client? Have you seen them in their living environment? Have you had an opportunity to obtain firsthand knowledge about the child's health, well-being, et cetera?
And I'm just going to interrupt so I have
Yeah.
an understanding. So you're saying then those questions need to be asked of the child's lawyer.
Correct.
But who would be doing the
The
asking?
court.
So in your recommendations, because we can say this all day long and say, you have to do that, because we have been saying that, everyone has been saying that. But what you're really looking for is some sort of accountability that they're actually doing that. So beyond checking a box to say that they received the information and they have everything they need, how do we ensure that someone's actually doing their job and using that information to help the child? That's where we're stuck.
Right. I'm going to, if I can, just Associate Child Advocate Christina Guio has been interacting with the branch on this issue.
Thank you.
So I think you raise a really important point, right? Is we can give the attorney for the minor child information. We can't write a law that forces them to read it or do something with it, right? I think that's what you're getting at.
Right.
And what's the quality assurance? And so, as Sarah said, we sort of see it in multiple parts. One, modifying the law to require DCF to report certain things, to say where they got the information so that we know it's up to date when the court looks at it. They can say, oh, this was obtained in May from this person, right? So that's a piece. Second is having the court ask the lawyer questions, right? And, did you meet with your client and have you obtained information? The third piece is really the quality assurance from the Office of the Public Defender. And that is a really challenging piece because it's a contract system. So the vast majority of the people doing the work are not employees of the Office of the Public Defender. They're contracted with and they're private counsel. So they've done some things to try to create some quality assurance. They've created the guidelines, but it's very, very challenging to really get at. They can't review their files, right? They're not sort of going in and doing what your supervisor might do and say, let's sit down with this file and talk about what you did and didn't do. So that's why one of our recommendations is the working group to really look at how do we get at quality assurance and improving the actual quality. And I think that's that's really where you're at. But I think it's the most challenging piece, and it's why we recommended a working group to really come together and try to figure out how do we get to that quality assurance piece.
So for this working group, who do you envision being part of this working group?
I think the language, do I have the language in my folder? Let me see. The language that we have put together would include the Office of the Chief Public Defender, the Office of the Child Advocate, the KFAP, which is the organization foster parents, youth from the DCF Youth Advisory Board, because they're all represented, right? And have a lot to say, I think, about the quality of legal representation. A couple of other stakeholders, I'm sure I'm forgetting a couple of folks. And it would be a time-limited working group. And the purpose of that, the judicial branch, the purpose, DCF, the purpose of that would be to look at the structure for supporting quality legal representation, which has looked different 3 times, I think, since I've been a lawyer for kids, right? It used to be the judicial branch appointed, and then we had a child protection commission that appointed. Now it's the OCPD. And, and everybody's giving it their best, right? But it needs to be looked at. How do we fund it and support it, right? And so bringing the stakeholders around the table to look at what these systems have been, what's working about it, what isn't, and making recommendations back to the committee to say, this is how we think this is what we think is going to improve that system.
And is this something that Connecticut will be a leader on, or do you know of any similar issues in other states and similar working groups that have come to some sort of conclusion?
So this is an issue that a lot of jurisdictions have had to look at, right, and have come at it differently. The quality of legal most states, federal law requires that for children involved with child welfare agencies, that the child be appointed a legal representative who is knowledgeable and has firsthand knowledge. So lots of jurisdictions have tried to get at this in a variety of different ways. So we would not be breaking new ground in examining what our structure is and how to do the best that we can on behalf of some states have gotten sued over it because the quality of representation was so poor. That's what happened in New York many years ago. So I think this is an opportunity to bring stakeholders constructively around the table and say, let's look at our system and what we can do to improve it.
Do you think that New York has moved at least the needle a little bit towards solving the problem?
I don't know the answer to that. I could find out. I mean, there's a whole ABA Center on Children and the Law that works on this issue, and I think that would be something that a working group like this would also be looking at, right? Which is, what are we doing? What are other states doing that have been effective, and what lessons learned can we bring into our system? Our colleagues at OCPD, I think, are bringing new ideas to the table as we speak and are working with them, and they've been very open to suggestion, but I don't think it should stay bilateral between the OCA DCA and the OCPD, because I think other stakeholders, including youth, DCF, foster parents, courts, are going to have valuable things to weigh in on for us to consider.
Yeah, and I've just been saying for years that I'm sorry, I don't always see the value in studies and working groups. Because I think that there's information out there that we can apply. However, this is different. And it's different because it involves children and it involves our legal system. And I, for the life of me, could not find another state who's done it well and solved the problem. So, so this is one of those times where I think it's almost necessary to have this, because we can't look elsewhere for the answer, especially when the variables are so big here, and the outcomes are so dire. So, thank you very much for your testimony, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you. Representative Dauphiné.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your testimony. It was quite enlightening. And I was trying to keep up with everything that happened, but I did have just one question, because obviously it fell apart when the child went back to the biological mother. Can you just elaborate on how that happened? Like, did DC release the child to the mother? I mean, it sounded like they were, I'm just trying to understand that in the beginning where that happened.
Right, so Liam came into foster care somewhere around 6 months old. He had multiple fractures that doctors diagnosed as being due to child abuse. He was also diagnosed as failure to thrive. His weight was in the first or second percentile when he came into care. The court, juvenile court, then takes jurisdiction and issues orders about what serves the best interest of the child. So the court order, DCF brings the petition about the abuse and neglect to the court. The court issues an order committing the child, not always, but in Liam's case, committing the child to DCF guardianship. And Liam is placed in foster care. He did well in foster care, gained weight, was meeting developmental milestones. And during that time frame, the law requires that, absent exigent circumstances, that the state make reasonable efforts to reunify a child with a parent. The mother was identified, for the most part, I wouldn't say conclusively, by staff as the non-offending parent, meaning folks did not think that she was the abuser. That was never definitively determined. That became a material issue in the case in hindsight. So as identified as the non-offending parent, DCF made appropriate referrals for parenting support services, for counseling. The reports back from providers about the mother's engagement with those services was positive. There were certainly visits taking place between the mother, Liam, and he had another somewhat older sibling who was also in foster care. And law requires that within 9 months of a child coming into state custody, this is federal law, that the state file what's called a permanency plan with the juvenile court and ask approval for that and file a study in support of that. And that plan was filed on Liam's behalf and called for him to be eventually the goal of reunification with his mother. And then the law says that the court then approves the plan or not. If it approves the plan, it sets out the goals and the time frame for reunification and any services that should be given to the child and family to effectuate the plan or the goal. In order for commitment of a child to end, i.e. foster care, the state has to file a motion with the court to revoke or dissolve its commitment and restore the parent's custodial rights. There's been an informal practice at DCF of returning children who are committed home under commitment. This is sometimes also referred to as a extended trial home visit. So once the goal of reunification was approved by the court, it's a little intricate, I know. The department made a plan to reunify Liam under commitment with his mother. And then the plan was that they would subsequently, if it went well, file a motion to revoke that commitment with the juvenile court. Federal law envisions that states have a system for that and allow states to draw down dollars for that, to support that. Connecticut does not have a legal framework for doing that. So it was our position, and the department, in all candor, did not agree with our legal position, but it was our position that state law in Connecticut does not permit that, because under our law, decisions about custody and guardianship are delegated exclusively to the juvenile court. Juvenile court puts you in foster care, right? It's a best interest determination. The law requires that to dissolve that, you need another order of the court. So Liam was placed home through this informal process, and the court was not notified. And then when things happened, the court was also not notified, and the child's attorney was not notified. So we identified that as a systems problem. Actually, want to be clear, we support the idea of transition, right? We don't want kids, you need a transition process that may include time in the parent's home. It may even look somewhat like a trial home visit, but we have to have parameters for that. Who was responsible for Liam once he went home? Not clear. The state was still responsible. That legally, right? But he stayed in that legal limbo for 6 months. And that cannot recur, right? So that is an area where I think we do have agreement with the department on, and I'm really glad about that. They came to the table really productively, had good ideas, and I think we're going to be able to, with the committee's consideration and approval of the language, fix that, right? So that there's a notice requirement, sort of time requirement, and some specificity that this is how the child's needs are going to be met in that transition process. We don't want to get rid of the transition. We just want a framework for it. Does that answer your question? That was long, but it's complicated.
It is complicated, and
Yeah.
thank you. It gave me a little bit more clarity, but very sad, but thank you.
Representative Wieland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here today. I have 2 questions. Looking at your recommendations at recommendation number 2, which is the development of a public and accountable framework for disclosure of data information by DCF regarding the child's well-being. Can you explain how the privacy aspect of that would be managed as if it's a front-facing situation?
Yes. So the vision is that any data that is released is aggregate data and de-identified, and likely would align with the kinds of data that the federal government looks at as well when it audits Connecticut on these measures.
Perfect. That's good to hear. The other thing I wanted to ask, and this is maybe based on your research into these situations, beyond the lack of communication with legal counsel and the court system, were there changes in the caseworkers that were assigned to specifically to Liam's situation? Was there anything else that would have led to that kind of breakdown in communication back and forth about where he was, how he was doing, what things weren't happening?
That's a great question, Representative Wielander. Although in the way the system works is there's a worker and a team assigned for the investigation period. That's the first 45 days. Then case transitions to ongoing services, and there's another worker assigned, and there wasn't disruption. So I think sometimes, yes, that happens, and there's always, transition creates opportunity and challenges. That wasn't the case here. I think, when your question really gets at like, where's the breakdown? And I think it's an important question, right? And I think that, and these workers assigned to Liam, no exception, people go to work trying to do a good job for kids and families, right? And And what I think is that, so the agency has lots of protocols, right? You get the case, you do this, you visit X number of times a month, you get these collaterals every single month. The federal law says, up, this is the information you're supposed to get. You file with the court, you get these approvals, right? Those are in place for a reason, right? Because otherwise, if we're not doing that, what happens in my view is our brains take shortcuts, right? And I think that's just a professional hazard, right? And you may decide early, and I'm telling you what I think, not what I know, but I think what happens is you decide early, the mom is the non-offending parent. Mom is trying, I like mom, I trust mom. So when mom tells me, so that decision, that's how you get to, we're going to reunify with mom, even though we didn't really know who caused the injuries to Liam, right? But we decided it wasn't mom. Right. And once that decision is made, once it's like, well, I believe mom and that's the plan and that's what we're doing. And we're not doing these other things that we're supposed to do sort of meticulously. And supervisors aren't making sure we're doing those things meticulously. And the systems data we do have confirms that that's a widespread issue. Right. Then we miss things. Right. And that bias, that decision we made early becomes the trajectory of the case. So when mom says, oh, Liam looks like that because he's been sick. Oh, I took him back to the doctor. He gained 2 pounds. That was a lie. The worker asked. She didn't call the pediatrician back. She didn't get the medical record. She asked the mother. Right. And that was the answer the mother gave her. But that's why we have these protocols in place. Right. And 11 months prior to Liam's death, he was scheduled for he was supposed to have an 18-month well child appointment. That didn't happen. Didn't happen because he was home informally. It was sort of nobody's responsibility to get him there, right? He comes in April, 8 months before his death. He's already lost weight since he came home from foster care, but nobody knew that because nobody had obtained the medical records, right? Now we flash forward 6 more months to October. He goes to the doctor. Doctor finds him back in the first percentile. He's lost weight since April, diagnoses him as failure to thrive, calls the caseworker same day, which is not an everyday event. There's no record made of it and nobody gets the medical record, right? That's where the breakdown happens, right? Then you go back in November to the home and you ask mom, hey, what's going on with Liam's weight? Oh, he's been sick. Right. And that's the breakdown. Nobody goes back and gets the record. These things are required. The policy is not the problem. It's the execution that's the problem. And so that's why, just bring it back full circle to our recommendations. That's why we're trying to standardize, right? This is the information that goes to the court. It's got to source it. When did it come from? The court should make findings about the child's health, safety, and well-being. And I'm really grateful that they're open to that. And Connecticut's not the only one doing that. I mean, judicial bench cards, things like that are in existence in other jurisdictions to make sure these things don't fall through the cracks. And the lawyer needs to be able to do what they're supposed to do, right? So it all comes back to that because everybody's going to work trying to do a good job. But without the protocolization, we lose things.
Thank you for that answer. I think, I know that people, like you said, those involved are going to work to try to make sure that the kids are safe and that they're cared for, that the parents have what they need. But there seems to be a systemic breakdown.
Right.
And beyond your recommendations, I would imagine that more sets of eyes on these cases, more caseworkers, more staffing at the agency might also be very helpful in making sure that we can go back and check, are the I's dotted and the T's crossed, and are people talking to each other? So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none and none online. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next up, we'll have Andrew Feinstein and followed by, I'm sorry, Melanie Wild Lane. I apologize. Then Andrew Feinstein and then John Flanders.
Good afternoon. I'm Melanie Wild Lane. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Association of School-Based Health Centers. I come before you today to testify in support of Senate Bill 327, an act establishing a task force to study the effects of hate speech. I've submitted written testimony with data and that you all can read, but today I sit before you as a mother of a 21, almost 22-year-old college student who identifies as a Black male. When he enters the room, he does not go unnoticed at 6'2", 260 pounds. He grew up in New Britain and went to school there and also attended a magnet school in Hartford. He was one of many Black students who had similar color, similar hair, uniforms, and living situations, single parent family. He may have been in maybe late middle school when he heard his first racial slur directed at someone. Fast forward, he's now a senior at Hampshire College in Amherst, Mass, where 71% of the population is white, non-Hispanic. Tuition for Hampshire is comparable to a private school in Connecticut, about $58,000 a year, affordable only to a few. 500 students attend. This is where he was first met with his first targeted racial discrimination. Sean carries a backpack everywhere he goes. It's like he's his Ninja Turtle shell, right? It's just him. He will carry that backpack to a party, to a bar, to a grocery store. Does not matter. So one night at a party, student stops him and says, "Hey, are you a narc?" And he says, "No," but they continue. It was right after, then they proceeded to call him a cop lover. This happened right after the George Floyd death. He was rattled. Fast forward again to his apartment on campus where it's made up of 3 BIPOC students and 3 white males. His 3 roommates, white roommates, began subtly to escalate with comments about cleaning and how they didn't have to clean, but the 3 other students did. They would leave messes in the common areas, make comments regarding the 3 BIPOC students needing to clean up for them because that's their role in the apartment. The white students made comments such as, "Our maids look like you," and "So don't our housekeepers." While this may seem like subtle, targeted hate speech, it lands the same. These are targeted, intentional acts of hate, which could have created a larger issue. Here's where I get to brag. Sean decided that he needed to take things into his own hands because no one else was. This privileged behavior was happening all over campus. He proactively met with deans and began to talk about reported and non-reported incidents. They worked out a plan to better deal with each individual incident, as well as how to best educate the students. Mandatory cultural sensitivity training is now built into the curriculum and a prereq for graduation. Each year, they have to participate in several learning modules. They have increased the course curriculums on diversity, inclusion, and racial justice on campus and have partnered with their 4 other colleges in their consortium. What I learned in this process is that one person can make a difference. They create a ripple effect. With each ripple, the ripple gets bigger and wider. It is not the targeted community's responsibility to teach us. It is our responsibility to teach ourselves, to read, to educate, to attend lectures and conferences, and to listen to the voices. What I also learned is college kids are smart. But this is just the starting point. One that as a mother and as an executive director, I think this task force is, and again, I am not always for task force. I understand. I'm on a lot of them, so I get it. But I'm passionate about this one because I think it opens up conversation. So thank you for your time. And I'll take any questions if you have them.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Quick question, how old, what year was your son in when he started this?
He was a sophomore
He was a
in
sophomore.
in college,
And now he's a senior.
and now he's graduating in May.
And in those 2 years, praise God, in those 2 years, he has managed to not only use his voice, but use his voice amongst the 4 colleges in the region. And
Yes.
I went to UMass, so I
Yes.
understand what impact that will have. There's a lot of students. At my time, it was 23,000 students. I'm sure it's much bigger now.
It's huge.
Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you. Please share our thanks to your son.
I
And
will
thank you
embarrass
for your
him later, don't
testimony.
worry. Thank you.
Any Representative Linehan?
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming to tell your son's story. Please also share with him that I'm thankful that he even allowed you to come and say that, because my kids put the kibosh on that.
So allowed is a very general term. He knows I'm here today. He does not know why, and he definitely does not know about this story, but
But
sometimes you have to keep things to yourself as a parent.
well, I'm going to play that on loop for my kids. But yes, thank you really so much. And I just want to clarify, I'm with you on the study thing, but for those who maybe not understand, and I had said this to my co-chair, if we are studying because we don't know the answers, that's important. It's when we know the answers, but we can't pass it, that we turn it into a study just to confirm what we already know. That's where I have my issue.
And we know that kids are experiencing these hate crimes. They're not reporting them. They don't want to go to their SRO at school. The
Yeah.
parents don't want to go and involve the police. And sometimes it seems like that's an unnecessary step, right? But what I'm learning from my son's community, who do not like to teach me, but I force them to, is that in order to take steps, you have to start asking questions.
Yeah.
And you don't know what you don't know if you haven't walked in those same shoes. And so what lands on me lands differently on someone else. And so this is a step in the right direction to start asking questions about how we can be better.
And that gets to the crux of it. And I couldn't agree more. I wholeheartedly support this. I think it's important that we look at racism, we look at LGBTQ issues, homophobia, transphobia, that we look at misogyny,
Yeah.
that we look at political hate speech on any side, because somewhere, some kid is being hurt by what the adults in their presence say. And that's what we need to get to the heart of. So thank you very much for being here.
Okay.
Representative Wieland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to sort of echo actually what you said as a graduate of UMass Amherst myself, and actually a native of that area, which the Five College or the Happy Valley is what I
Mhm.
grew up in. It was really hard to hear that your son was experiencing these kinds of treatments, and his roommates were as well. But I'm really proud to hear how the college has responded, how the five colleges have responded, because those are of varying sizes. And the fact that they are all taking those steps to try to make sure that their campuses are safe for everyone means that if that consortium can do it, then we can do it. Different organizations can do it. They can be put into practice. So thank you for sharing that
welcome.
and for your written testimony as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. Andrew Feinstein.
Hello, my name's Andy Feinstein. I'm legislative chair of Special Education Equity for Kids in Connecticut, SEEK. I wear another hat as well. I'm a member of the Connecticut Hate Crimes Advisory Council appointed by Governor Lamont. We commend the committee for taking up Raised Bill 327. The bill is focused on the effects of hate speech on the mental and physical health and educational achievement of children. This is an important aspect of hate speech, but the deleterious effects go much farther. To that end, the legislature created the Connecticut Civics Education, Civics Engagement, and Media Literacy Task Force last year as part of Public Act 23150. The purpose of these two task forces should be the same: to teach and encourage students to engage with others in a respectful way, to listen to others, and to not judge others based on their race or political views or identity. Now, there's no better predictor of hate crimes than hate speech. Individuals who commit crimes of bigotry and prejudice almost always reveal their animus in speech or in social media posts long before committing the crime. The First Amendment protects most hate speech, and indeed only a minority of those who post hate speech ever commit a hate crime. Sadly, therefore, we cannot effectively use the best predictor of hate crimes to prevent hate crimes. The situation is far different, however, for school children. Schools can and do prohibit hate speech and do punish students who engage in it. Still, that approach is reactive. Using a punitive model informs students that hate speech is unacceptable. What we need is an educational program that teaches students tolerance, acceptance, respect, and treating others as individuals. That's what a good civics education program should provide. It should be skill-based, not knowledge-based. That students should have the experience of working side by side with students they would otherwise have little to do with to overcome a challenge or to complete a difficult project. Students should listen to opposing views and then be able to articulate such views in a fair and forceful manner. Students should learn and practice the art of compromise, and students should understand that black and white thinking is unacceptable. Hate speech is of particular interest to SEEK because students with disabilities are disproportionately the victims of bullying and hate speech. Last session, the legislature passed a major revision to the previously failed and ineffective bullying law contained in sections 47 through 75 of Public Act 23-167. The focus is now on maintaining and creating a safe school climate and resolving incidents of aggression and hate through restorative practices. It'll take some time to see whether this new restorative rather than punitive approach works, but the goal remains the same. Hate speech is not only unacceptable in school, it is also not used by responsible, mature citizens. Hate speech not only has a seriously negative impact on children, it undermines the basic support for civil society. Hate speech is not only an assault against the victim, it is also an assault on democracy. Now, in terms of the membership of the task force, we urge two additions. One is the chair or designee of this Connecticut Hate Crimes Advisory Commission should be a member, as well as somebody from the special ed community, and we at SEEK would be glad to serve. Appreciate the opportunity to testify, and I really regret not being able to be there in person with you today.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I do have a question. Thank you for the work that you are doing with the Media Literacy Task Force, SEEK, and the Connecticut Hate Crimes Advisory Council. It's very appreciated. My question is, when, if at all, when do you expect to see any results from the work that you're already putting in place?
The Civics Task Force, like so many task forces created by the legislature, has not been appointed yet. I'm trying to work with Representative Brown, Representative Poulos, Chairman Curry to try to get it appointed, but it has not happened yet. So the answer is I have no idea when this is going to move forward. But I think it's going to take a commitment of all of us to make it happen.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I think. So we don't really have any idea yet on restorative justice practices.
Well, in terms of the restorative practices, the new bullying or the new replacement for the bullying law is in effect the districts have can use their existing practices for this year, and next year they can opt into the new practices which are endorsed not only by this social emotional learning collaborative, but also by the Connecticut Association of Boards of Education. And a lot of schools already are moving towards a much more restorative type of practice. But in terms of evaluation of it, there is no formal evaluation mechanism that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, we appreciate your testimony.
Thank you very much, Senator. I appreciate it.
Next up, John Flanders, followed by Harold Bailey.
Figured out the technology. Good afternoon, Senator Maher, Representative Linehan, Representative Dauphiné, and members of the committee. My name is John Flanders, and I'm the president of Special Education Equity
Council. They were voting on their own.
And I am here to follow my colleague, Mr. Feinstein, and also Mel in support of raised Bill 327. This is particularly important to SEEK because the kids that we represent are especially involved with hate speech. Those kids are perhaps the canaries in the mine shaft. Hate speech is generally directed at people who are weaker or different. You cannot find anybody weaker or different than a child with a disability. Our children have conditions that make them more susceptible to the impact of hate speech during their time. Our children react differently than a typical person might. They may push back, they may yell, they may melt down, they may engage in inappropriate behavior. And finally, children with disabilities occasionally engage in behavior that looks like hate speech, but it is not done on a voluntary hateful basis. It is done simply as a reaction to that child's disability. I can give examples, but I don't think I shall. For that reason, we think that it is imperative that this commission includes somebody who is effective and understands the needs of children with disabilities. The fact is that we need to work on not just the impact on the victim of the hate speech, we need to consider the motivation and the causes of the person doing this. Without knowing both of those factors, we're simply not going to come up with a solution. Further, Andy talked about the punitive and disciplinary approach to these things. We strongly support the belief that that isn't going to work until we have an understanding, until we reach into the minds and hearts of these children and find out what is driving this and teach them how not to do it. We are simply not going to solve this problem. So to move forward, one, we believe that it should be an organization involved with children with disabilities involved, and we respectfully volunteer SEEK as a potential participant. I also wear the hat of the chair of the Advocacy and Legislative Committee for CASBAC, for the Connecticut Association of School-Based Health Centers. And I would also like to recommend that CASBAC get a motivation or a membership in this, because they do provide mental health professionals that are dealing with literally hundreds, probably thousands of children with issues that can be dealt with. And finally, let me support my colleague, Mr. Feinstein, in his recommendation for the Hate Crimes Commission, that I think also should be a member of this. I will be brief, and thank you for your attention, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Appreciate your testimony, and just one check. Let me check Zoom. Make sure that we're, oh my God. There we go. No questions on that.
I jinxed
thank you
by
very
saying I
much.
could handle the technology. Thank you very much.
Next up, we have Harold Bailey. Welcome, Mr. Bailey.
Let me unmute here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. I'm first delivering a message as chair of Team Westport. Team Westport is the diversity council responsible for making the town of Westport, Connecticut, increasingly welcoming with respect to race, religion, ethnicity, and LGBTQIA. And I am speaking, and I'm going to also provide a personal testimony. Both are focused on support of Senate Bill 327. Over the past decade, through our Teen Diversity Essay Contest, and this is Team Westport, as well as Staples High School Alumni Project, in the summer of 2020, Team Westport has amassed a significant number of testimonials regarding the impact of hate speech and ongoing bias on children. While these testimonials and observations were particular to Westport, we believe them to be reflective of towns with similar demographics across Fairfield County and the state of Connecticut. In summary, as a group, they reflect harm that can be both traumatic and enduring over the long term. And so what we are entering into the record are the 30 or so essays from our teen diversity essay contests over the past decade, with particular focus on the 2017 winners, and there are 3 each year, around white privilege, and the 2019 essays, which focused on bias and its impact from the point of view of stereotypes. We also have provide the links to the other 8 sets of winning essays, which are on our website as well. Now, with regards to the Staples Alumni Project, in summer of 2020, inspired by the discussions that had ensued on racial equity at Staples High, several recent Staples grads who were home from college spent weeks gathering input from many dozens of their peers regarding the racial climate at Staples. This is a video that we provide the link to, which is a summary of their detailed findings and individual alumni statements, and there were dozens of them, which were submitted to the Board of Education and the incoming superintendent at that time. So we fully support the convening of the task force and the forming of it, and stand ready to support it in any way that we can once it's in place. Now I wanted to make my own personal statement. I spent the first 16 years of my life under legal segregation in the state of Tennessee. At the age of 15, I was part of a small group of Black students who integrated a formally segregated high school of over 1,500 students. During the first weeks, we were regularly greeted with catcalls and slurs, including the N-word, from white parents as we entered the school. For months, we walked through crowded halls and were peppered with monkey sounds, jungle calls, and the N-word. Of course, the impact on that school as a learning environment was immediate and profound. It was the environments established by each teacher in each of our classes which controlled the degree to which even the most rudimentary sense of belonging that's requisite for learning could even exist. Overall, the experience was frightening, and it's traumatic even to this day. Some decades later, as a citizen of Westport, my wife and I parented our children through their being called the N-word at middle and high school levels. In each instance, my wife and I supported our children at home while spending a good deal of time with administrators aggressively explaining the damage done, but to people with authority and no lived experience. The result was always apologies and some consequences for the attacking students. However, while both children were strong academically, the cumulative toll that the learning environment was taking on who they were becoming was such that we moved them from Westport schools to Exeter and Choate, where they flourished. For the past 2 decades, we've worked to address this problem in Westport. And when I say we, it's my wife and I, in Westport schools via our work in Team Westport and beyond. However, with the pervasive growth of social media and the recent political environment, the N-word pass has normalized the term at middle and high school levels. In addition, there are reports of monkey sounds in crowded high school hallways and 5th graders asking 1st and 2nd graders to say VINEGAR and knowingly laugh. I now see the advent of the same dynamic I lived through as a child and parent being visited upon my grandson. There is no task force needed to discover whether hate speech presents a fundamental impediment to learning and delivers a lifelong trauma. It does, and combating it should become a top priority statewide and nationwide. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I know how long and hard you've worked on this and leading up Team Westport and doing very good work there. It seems to me that we're at an inflection point that no one wants to be at, that
Right.
we're hearing this coming more and more. You referenced in your submitted testimony that you're seeing it with your own grandchildren. And I wondered if you could just speak a little bit more about that, if you'd be willing to.
Well, it seems to have what I guess was a combination of social media, supposedly rap, and so on, actually helped spark this idea of an N-word. The N-word pass is where you can say that word if you are white to other people in the environment, whether they are of color or they're white, and that's okay. And it's become such a common usage now that it's like it's part of the atmosphere now at some level of school culture. And so for athletes, for others, where people gather and maybe there's rap music and so on, the word gets used. It's in the vernacular. And once that's there with the current environment also, where there's social media that's pushing people in different directions, the use of it and the ugliness of it has just gotten out of control. And so what we've seen is it's come down to the middle school level, and now it's a combination of jokes where maybe, as I said here, a fifth grader has something to say, or someone who is a little bit older than some of the very younger kids are starting to make jokes or references to the word. And it's even showing up now among the very youngest children. When I say the youngest, I mean first graders, second graders. Not that they're running out to use it necessarily, but they're coming home to ask, what is it? And why was it mentioned to me? That kind of thing. So it's just out of control. And the only way we're going to really impact this is what we as a group, this is Team Westport, have been saying for years, which is the hearts and minds of the parents and the people in our community. And I think what's going on here is not unique to Westport. I think it's all over Fairfield County, around towns that are very similar to ours. But we've been trying to face it and trying to make the case that the town itself, the people, each of us as individuals, has to take some responsibility to affect this with the people that we interacted with our children, with the people at work, visit, study in town when they're there, to make sure that not just use of a blatant slur goes away, but also the microaggressions that go along with interacting with people and things that are said about people when they're not around are effective as well. So we've been looking at it not only for anti-Black and BIPOC slurs and hate, but clearly for anti-Semitism and the growth that's happened recently, as well as LGBTQIA hate and ethnicity. I mean, it's proliferated over the last few years like crazy since the pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. I have no other questions. Does anyone else on the committee seeing? Yes, Representative?
Just quickly, I want to thank you for your work you're doing in Westport. I'm just over the line in Fairfield, and I'm so sorry for what your family has gone through. And I think too often we like to write these, when we hear about these incidents in the news, we like to write them off as one-off incidents or as isolated occurrences. But, you embody the problem. You were a leader in fighting segregation back when you were a youth, and here you are fighting the same battles for your grandchildren. So I thank you for sharing your story and your testimony, and look forward to maybe working with you some more as we move this forward.
Thank you. Sure.
Thank you. I do actually have one question. I've heard that this is being called bullying now, that the racial slurs, the noises in the hallway, it's been called bullying. And I'm curious what your thinking is on that.
My thinking is we have to identify this as something that's very different from bullying in general. Because bullying is such a huge umbrella. It can be as little as a kid nudges me and pushes me around. This is this is very vicious, and it has such a strong impact that I think it should be called out as hate speech. And we need that category separated from bullying, or at least highlighted in bullying in terms of the consequences and the priority in terms of elevating the way that it's handled by, by schools, by towns inside of the state. So that's especially what we're hearing recently in terms of both anti-Semitic and anti-Black slurs that have come from the Jewish community and from the Black community in Westport.
Thank you again for being here, and thank you for submitting testimony.
Sure.
Nicholas Kapoor, followed by Laura Orban.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicholas Kapoor. I'm the chairman of the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. I'd like to thank the chairs and the ranking members for allowing me to testify today in support of SB 327. I'd like to ditto basically everything that has been said already and just add a bit more context. Exposure to hate speech at a young age can have severe long-term consequences, negatively affecting children's psychological health and hindering their educational attainment. And what this task force would produce as a report, I believe, would be very important to so many of the conversations we're having around these issues today, as was just said. I served on a board of education from 2019 to 2022 in my hometown of Monroe. We took part in the Harvard Graduate School of Education's Making Caring Common project, which surveyed our students. It was basically a climate survey for our school. About 15% of students did not feel safe in our school bathrooms, and the same percentage either felt excluded or were called mean names frequently or most of the time. Interestingly, in the survey that was done in 2019, so the data is still relatively new, about 20% of our students identified as something other than heterosexual. In February of 2023, Gallup did a massive survey across the country with a nationally representative sample and found that 19.7% of Generation Z identifies as members of the LGBTQ+ population. As the previous speaker just said, we've seen anti-Semitic remarks increase in our school systems. There's also been a lot of anti-LGBTQ+ remarks in our school system and really just in society. And so as the proportion of people who identify as members of the LGBTQ+ community continues to rise, we need to be very cognizant of how they are affected by these kinds of speech, this kind of speech. Our children, I would offer, are also in the midst of a mental health crisis for many reasons. COVID-19 induced isolation and educational disruption, the rise of social media and a new generation needing to keep up with the Joneses, with making sure they're keeping up with everything they see on social media, as well as an increase in bullying both online and in schools. I'm a professor at Fairfield University, and I have to tell you that I've seen a marked difference in my students and how they relate to one another and interact with me in the 10 years that I've been teaching. I would offer to the committee a few recommendations to strengthen the bill. First, I would propose adding the executive director of the CHRO or her designee to the bill. We are the agency in charge with enforcement of our non-discrimination statutes, and I believe that our voice on this task force could be very important. I would also advocate for an additional slot or the amending of one of the legislative leaders' appointments to be mandatory that it be a teacher. Our teachers are on the front lines with our students every single day. They are living the increase in all of the different things that we are seeing, and I believe their voice on this task force would be very, very helpful and needed. Third, I would also recommend adding 2 high school students to the task force, analogous to our State Board of Education. I believe that their voices in this work is extremely important. Between when I submitted my written testimony and now, I didn't have in my written testimony a way to appoint these people or a suggestion. Perhaps the committee might consider the co-chairs of this committee having a joint appointment of one person, and the ranking members of this
Can you
committee
please
having
summarize
a
your
joint
testimony?
appointment of one person. I'd like to thank the committee for raising this bill. This is very, very important work. The CHRO supports the work of this committee on this bill. And I want to thank you for continuing to work to enhance the lives of all of our children. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. A quick question, and it's really following up on what I asked the previous, Mr. Bailey, the previous person, which is, you mentioned bullying and how do the staff effectively respond to bullying? And yet, my question is it really bullying? Bullying has a different connotation in my mind, and I'm curious where you come out on that.
I would agree with the last speaker. I think bullying right now is a bit of a catch-all term, but I think with the rise in incident rate of different types of hate speech and things that we're seeing with our children, and again with just across society, we're coming up with new language. I'm not sure exactly what that language should be, but I believe that the task force could investigate this, and the task force's charge should be as holistic as possible to produce to this committee a robust report on everything that they find.
Thank you so much. Seeing no other questions. Nope, I apologize. Representative Dauphiné.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you for your testimony today. I'm just, with this bullying and hate speech, I'm trying to understand, how would you define bullying and how would you define hate speech? Could you just help me with that?
Yes, thank you for your question, Representative Dauphiné. Again, I think that before I directly answer your question, I think that the task force, when they present their report to the committee, this is the language and the way that we define things, not only colloquially in how we conversate with one another, but also statutorily, should be very well defined. And in the CHRO statutes, I think that would also help us as we adjudicate claims that come to our agency. For me personally, I think that bullying could be physical, it could be verbal. I think the net has to be cast as wide as possible. I think hate speech has to do more with targeted groups. As you all are well aware, in Connecticut, we have 37 protected classes, again, that are in the CHRO statutes, and you can file a claim with our agency if you feel you've been discriminated against as a member of one of those classes. And that discrimination was because you are a member of one of those classes. And so hate speech to me would fall more along the lines of being part of one of those protected classes. Whereas bullying, I think, is a bit more of a catch-all term that might not be as specific as the specific list of protected classes that we have in statute that you, again, all are well aware that we add to almost every year.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Seeing no other questions, I appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Next up is Laura Orban.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for allowing me to testify in support of SB 327. I am a parent in Brookfield and a longtime organizer. Recently, my town of Brookfield has fielded 3 book challenges at the Board of Education level. In all 3 cases, the books contained LGBTQ+ subject matter. In all 3 cases, the parents who brought these complaints forward insisted that they have nothing against gay, bisexual, or transgender youth. In all 3 cases, there was discussion on Facebook, in homes, and in public meetings about why these books were so inappropriate and the importance of preserving our children's innocence. So last March, as the second book challenge was surfacing, the book that was being challenged at that time was titled "This Book is Gay." I requested correspondence to the Board of Education related to that challenge under the Freedom of Information Act. And one of the first letters that the Board of Ed received began with the following. It was, "Dear members of the Board of Ed, this is the first of more emails to follow that deal with LGBTQIA+ themed books in the high school library. A search of the library catalogs has been completed for 75 of these books. 14 were found." The author of that email then went on to indicate that he was sending it to 240 parents in Brookfield. And that led to the book challenge. This effort to challenge these books is targeted. It is hate, and it is an attack on LGBTQ+ students and their right to access reading material that reflects themselves and on their humanity. Members of the community willingly or blindly join in, but regardless of their degree of awareness, our children are paying the price. According to the Trevor Project, 45% of LGBTQ youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, but that rate is lower among those who felt that their school was gender affirming. Nationally, book challenges are on the rise. The most challenged books are either by or about people of color or LGBTQ+ authors or subject matter. There is a cost to all of our students with these book challenges. Public schools should be a place where every student can see themselves and every kid can see that the world is filled with all kinds of people, not just the ones who look like them and think like their parents. Illinois recently became the first state to pass legislation to prevent book bans in its public schools. So my request is that this task force include the study of these numerous targeted book challenges and the effects on our children in its work. These challenges and the carefully crafted and coordinated approach and the outcome of the challenges do have an effect on their children, and I believe that we can do better. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for your testimony. We appreciate you being here.
Thank
Any
you.
questions? Seeing none, thank you again. Next up, we will have, and I apologize if I do not pronounce your name correctly, but Tiziana Arma.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The concern about it. It's Tiziana Arma. Thank you so much for allowing me to address you today. I want to, first of all, who am I? I am Dr. Tiziana Arma. I am couple of things. I am the president of the Connecticut Psychiatric Society. I am the chief psychiatry officer at the Community Health Center Incorporated. I am an assistant clinical professor at Yale University in the Department of Psychiatry. However, I'm coming to you as an individual, as a community psychiatrist in support of SB 327. And I do so because, over a decade ago, maybe 12, 13 years ago, when I began practice out of residency, some of my first patients were adolescents who were coming to me from Greenwich and New Canaan. And it was incredible to me, especially as a new mom, I had a 1-year-old at the time, how many of these children came to me having had this sort of stark change in their behavior, in their emotional well-being. Their parents came to me after they had put them in schools similar to what Mr. Bailey talked about in those environments where they didn't see themselves. And they were experiencing a great deal of racial discrimination and daily microaggressions. And it took a lot to get them to even tell me about it, right? They came to me for depression. They came to me for anxiety. But what I was able to uncover reluctantly from them was that a lot of this had to do with the experiences they were having. So I want to just tell you, I wasn't able to submit my testimony written yet, but I will be sending you all written testimony. But I want to just say, first of all, that the literature is very clear. And I also want to say, because I've heard you this whole time talking about bullying, talking about wording, I think that it's really easy to focus on anything but race. So but because it's really challenging to talk about. But we really do have to, and we have to say those words, right? So the racial discrimination, the use of the N-word, not just the use verbally, but also in text messages online, that level of it really needs to be addressed, specifically around race. And so I absolutely am in support of this bill and want to allow really just to state that we are available. There are a number of experts right down the street who can give some additional feedback around what things to look for and how to evaluate. But the key pieces, I think, are really planning and making sure that there's monitoring of outcomes and effectiveness of interventions. And this is not a one-town problem. It's not a just private school problem. And at the end of it, I just want to point out that there are dire consequences for Black youth. As young as 5 years old, we have seen double the rate of suicide in children as young as 5 to 12 years old in the recent years. And so this starts as early as preschool. I'm a mother of 2 young girls, and we've been impacted. We've moved schools because of the daily microaggressions and the impact, and watching my own little bright star dim for my oldest child. And so this is something that's very, very important to me. I've written a great deal about it. Happy to share any information going forward. But I have family friends who are in the news right now because they are experiencing this. And so I just implore you, thank you for your commitment to this and for bringing this up in the first place. And if there are any questions, and I'll say, I usually am a bit more at ease, but when I tell you that the emotions that I feel about this, having been touched by it in my own life, are very deep. So I apologize for that, but thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Dr. Arma, thank you. I truly appreciate you taking the time, and I have seen you present before testimony, and I know that you are much more organized in your testimony. And don't mean to say you're not organized. What I'm saying is it's clear that this is an emotional and deeply felt feeling. And I also appreciate that you called out bullying versus the issue that it is, which is racism, which is part of what we're looking at: racism, anti-Semitism, transphobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, so much that is happening to our children and has a long-term impact. And the reasons for my questioning around bullying was to pull out the fact that this is not what it is. It is not bullying. So that isn't actually a question for you. It's just a statement. I'm curious if anyone else has anything they'd like to ask. No? Seeing not, I look forward to reading your testimony, and I very much appreciate you being here.
Thank you. And thank you for pointing it out. I could see that you were making that clear, that this, and I appreciate that because it's so important. I think it's just so difficult to talk about race that it's so often that people, they don't want to do it. And it's because it's scary. And the reality is that we all come to the world with some bias. We all walk into the room, but it's about our actions and the repercussions of those actions.
Absolutely. And apologies, Senator Anwar, I did not see your hand.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Arma, for your testimony and again, putting this in real terms. I know you're a psychiatrist and you're one of the top psychiatrists in our community, so we appreciate your work that you're doing. Have you seen the long-term impact on the children who have been bullied? And could you explain a little bit about what the entire trajectory of the life of the individuals get impacted from racism or bullying or hate-based incidents?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Senator Anwar. So yeah, first of all, I have seen it. Those are the children who walked through my doors early on, but both in studies and what I see here in Connecticut, are that oftentimes these children are becoming increasingly depressed to the point that they need to be in long-term therapy, medications. I also see adults. And so I also see that with my adults as well, where they can actually tell you about instances that have scarred them really for life. And because it wasn't addressed in that time, so a lot of people experience trauma, but it's really about how that trauma is addressed in the time and the level of support that people get through the community and through the leaders. And so it's twofold. One, you want to not let it happen at all. But if it does occur, being able to make sure that you're supported. So people on medication because of things that happened like that, being traumatized, really. I think that's the key word, is that it's racial trauma that people end up experiencing. Also anxiety, severe anxiety, fear of going into certain spaces. And then another is academic achievement. So really having children end up not being able to perform as well. There's a lot of really good literature around how people are approached. There really needs to be sort of a celebration of difference, as opposed to this idea of sort of having a colorblind viewpoint. That the literature shows that just doesn't work. And I see it, in the world, anecdotally, I see it as well. But those are the long-term impacts: depression, anxiety, people ending up needing to be on medications who wouldn't have otherwise needed to, and just sort of whole changes in personality and interaction with people as a result.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And thank you, Doctor. We appreciate your being here. Next up is Gary Jones.
I just want to take a few minutes to introduce myself. My name is Gary Jones. I am the Jewish Community Relations Director of the Jewish Federation of Greater Fairfield County. On behalf of the Jewish Federation, I would like to speak in support of Senate 327. Unfortunately, hate speech and bigotry have been rising in our country in recent years. The toll on victims of hate speech of all ages is hard to quantify, but it is still readily apparent. Since the Hamas massacre in Israel on October 7th, hateful speech targeting the Jewish community has risen in unprecedented fashion. ADL has noted that reported incidents of anti-Semitism in Connecticut have increased by nearly 400% since October 7th. 30% of those incidents are school-based incidents. There is no doubt that too many Jewish students have been targeted in our schools. The consequence has often been that Jewish students have become more isolated and uncomfortable fully participating as students. This isolation and criticism clearly will, over time, impact both the health and achievement of our Jewish students. Although Jewish students may be the particular targets currently, we know that racism, Islamophobia, sexism, homophobia, mistreatment of children with disabilities, transphobia are all equally important, equally horrible, and equally harmful to our students. We know that people who hate rarely target only one community. We are pleased that the task force would examine the consequences of hate in its many manifestations, no matter who is the specific target at any particular time. We are stronger together, and the Jewish Federation believes that we should all work together to rid our society of hate and bigotry in all of its forms. This initiative would focus particularly on how hate impacts on our children, all of our children. Children are the most vulnerable among us, and their school years are too precious. We simply must do all that we can to ensure that the health and academic well-being of our students aren't threatened by hate. The Jewish Federation of Greater Fairfield County proudly supports Senate Bill 307. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Jones? Seeing none, we appreciate you taking the time to come and testify. Oh, excuse me, Senator Anwar, I'm doing it to you again. Apologies.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to thank you, Gary, for coming in and speaking. And I'm so sorry that the young boys and girls are having this challenging experience. It's a very challenging time, and what's happening is resulted in hatred that is resulted in not only the Jewish children, the Muslim children, or minority children are being impacted. So thank you for acknowledging that and raising our awareness. Appreciate your testimony. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Anwar, for everything you do. Really appreciate you.
Thank you. Next, we have Kayla, and Kayla, I apologize, Ionetta. I hope I got it right.
Sorry, technology issues. Yes, you got it right. Thank you. Can you guys hear me? I'm on my AirPods.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So I'm here in support of Bill 327. At first, I want to say that I second, I think it was Mr. Kapoor's suggestion to have teachers and students on the task force. And I'm going to read a personal testimony, and I think that's going to explain why. So I'm Kayla Ionetta. I'm joining today as someone who spends the majority of my time working with Connecticut youth as a teacher involved heavily in DEIB work and LGBTQ activism. I would like to say I'm also involved in nonprofit work, but I'm here on my own and I don't speak for that organization. As someone who was closeted in high school and who identifies as Hispanic, school meant an endless assault of stereotypes and hate speech that eroded my mental health and self-esteem. Not only did my peers spew hostility towards aspects of my identity, I also received the same messaging from family, closest friends, and almost all media, which ingrained in me that I was less than. Particularly because of rampant homophobic language amongst my peers, my anxiety ate away at me, causing extreme weight loss, episodes that led to self-harm, drug use, alcohol abuse, suicidal ideation, and daily anxiety-induced sickness every day for years. Had I not had to deal with constant negative messaging that fed the festering internalized homophobia, self-doubt, and self-loathing, my life may have been different. I may have been able to focus on school and other things that kids should have been focused on rather than fearing for my safety. Fast forward to now, I graduated college with the dream of being the teacher that I never had. I wanted to be there for kids who slipped under the radar and who needed support the most. When I started my career, it was an agonizing realization that kids of marginalized groups are still facing the same bigoted behaviors and language and mirroring similar thoughts and behaviors that I did and had. Unfortunately, most incidents are still going unreported. I have an open door policy with my students. Each day, I might have around 5 to 10 students come to visit or seek refuge. Day after day, more atrocious stories of bias, bullying, shaming, hate speech, racism, homophobia, transphobia get shared. I recently asked 3 students of color who were hanging out in my office how often they face racism in our schools. They said at least once a day about themselves, not including what they hear directed towards other people. That is constant and daily addition of trauma to these young people. The halls of our schools are eerily similar to the daunting and frightening halls that I once walked. There's abundant data readily available to us that overwhelmingly reports that students who identify within marginalized communities face mental health issues, bullying, harassment, and violence at higher rates than their peers. As an adult that faced so much hate as a child for my identity and who knows the journey an adult must take to begin healing, my heart breaks constantly for our youth. Something people of marginalized groups have in common is navigating daily fear, anxiety, shame, the threat of violence, and lifelong mental health issues, which are our leftover scars from the verbal abuse we received starting from our most impressionable ages. It is imperative as the adults making decisions for and with these kids that we take their lived experiences and testimonies seriously and start combating these issues head on. I'm speaking for my younger self and for the hundreds of students who have sought peace from constant ridicule and harassment that have walked through my office doors over the years. All of us accumulating lifelong trauma from our experiences. I support this task force. I believe it should be a top priority because I think it could be crucial in initiating targeted research focused on the effects of what our most vulnerable are facing every day in places where they're meant to be flourishing and safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Kayla. I know you to be a tremendous resource and support for the students in the high school. I know that your presence makes a difference in your life, in their life, And I'm very lucky to have spent time working with you. So thank you so much for being here today and for all that you do. And Representative Linehan.
Thank you very much. And thank you for being here and thank you for your testimony. As I'm sitting here listening to the testimony, I'm reminded of something I read very recently, and it was actually a white paper on weight bias towards children, especially young boys, and how there have been some study. It was a meta study, and there have actually been some studies that show that even teachers and administrators have had bias against heavier children, obese children, and would see them as instigators or bullies when in fact they're the ones being bullied. This really, really struck a chord with me. And I know that the bill really has to do with hate speech, but hate speech has a definition. And so therefore saying hate speech only would preclude us from looking at things that are biased speech that wouldn't be categorized under hate. So I guess what I wanted to ask you is that if we were to consider additional language to say hurtful speech, especially for the purposes of looking at how other students and teachers and administrators might have a bias against obese children, would you support that? Do you think there's a need for that?
I don't really know. I think that this task force, I think there's clear groups of children that, based on my testimony, I said that there's a lot of data showing that kids of marginalized groups, face a lot of hate. And I think this task force needs to be targeted. I can't speak to, children that are obese. I haven't read the paper, but if that falls under that category, I think it should stay targeted to
So
these
you don't
marginalized groups
see
that are facing these hate.
when you're teaching, you don't see the effects of name calling and bias towards overweight children as an effect on their mental health?
Oh, no, of course, it would have an effect on their mental health. I personally, with my expertise, I'm not sure if that would be, if those kids are under a protected class. I think that's a question for like a different person.
Right. And that was my point, is that the way it's written now would be only towards someone who would be hate speech as that defined area. And I think that if we're really talking about wanting kids to be more resilient and to understand the effects that these mean-spirited and bigoted language from other children and adults have on them, I don't think we can preclude ourselves from looking at the effects of mean talk about obese children. I actually feel very, very strongly about that. And I appreciate the work that you do. I would hope that educators would realize that, in fact, there's a lot of hate out there and a lot of bullying towards children who are overweight.
Yeah,
and
of course.
that affects their lives.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I agree that is, I think, again, I'm not the person to talk about who's in a protective class and who's not. I don't necessarily know, but I think kids that face targeted bullying for things about their identity and that is weight is something about those kids that they, might be facing bullying for. I think that it has detrimental effects on their mental health. So I can't say whether or not that would be included in this. With the way this is written, it sounds like you're saying no. So that might be something for consideration.
Great. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone? Sorry. Anyone else have any questions? And let me just make sure. Nope, I don't see any more online or in person. So thank you so much, Kayla, for being here.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Melissa Coombs, followed by Faith Sweeney.
Good afternoon. Dear Senator Maher, Representative Linehan, and distinguished members of the Committee on Children. I am here today in support of SB 327, an act establishing a task force to study the effects of hate speech on children's health and achievement. I have lived experience with hate speech. My youngest child was relentlessly targeted throughout middle school. He went from being a straight A student to C's and D's. His mental health declined, and he was eventually diagnosed with depression, anxiety, and emotional onset ADHD. Fear-based absences, self-harm, and suicidal ideation became daily concerns as a result of the hate speech and the school's unwillingness to create a safe learning environment for my child and others like him. The harassment was so severe and pervasive that the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights is investigating the school district for discrimination. Ultimately, I had to pull my child from our local school district, and he is now thriving in a learning environment that is free from hate speech. His GPA is nearly 1.5 points higher. He actively participates in class, and he feels a sense of belonging in his new school community. Hate speech spreads like a virus. Repeated exposure to verbal violence desensitizes children and reduces peer empathy. Left unchecked, it encourages more hate speech. Dehumanization of certain groups of people deteriorates the ability of others to empathize, leading to what the mental health community calls empathic numbing, a state of depletion in which compassion cannot be generated towards other people. This numbing at such a young age becomes ingrained in adulthood. It is imperative to recognize not only the impact of hate speech on victims, but also to ensure that the next generation isn't desensitized to understanding the experiences of others. My youngest childhood was stolen by hate speech. The proposed task force is a step in the right direction toward ensuring no other students' childhoods are stolen. And if I may, I offer one suggestion, which is to include a member of the Connecticut Social and Emotional Learning and School Climate Collaborative on the task force. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you speak just a little bit about the climate of the new school that your child went to and how it was different from the school that they left?
They actually execute the policies that are in place to, the safe school climate policies is enshrined and already in Connecticut's general statutes. They've done a lot of work in terms of the curriculum and in the adults around them. So kids like mine and other kids in protected classes see themselves in the curriculum and see themselves in the adults around them. They swiftly handle. I know of one incident that wasn't even hate speech, but it was swiftly and appropriately handled. Policies are only as good as the paper that they're written on, and some schools execute them well and others don't. So I think that's part of something that the task force could look at.
Thank you. Anyone else? Representative Linehan.
Thank you so much for being here. Also, thank you for recognizing the Social Emotional Learning Collaborative. That collaborative was put together by this committee. In fact, I'm not sure if anyone besides myself was on the committee at the time when we did that. It was years ago. It was based off of, unfortunately, a death by suicide of a young girl in my district.
Oh.
So it means a great deal to me. And it was you mentioning it as a validation that that collaborative is doing what it was supposed to do. But you are right that the policies aren't worth anything unless you have the humans behind them implementing those policies. And so I want to say I'm so glad that your child is doing better now.
Thank you.
That's really important that there was movement in that direction. Something that the bill that we wrote with the collaborative that was part of that was that it reminded parents that they can sue. in that legislation was that if a child's civil rights are being violated, whether it be by the school system or by another student and the school hasn't stepped in, that there is a right to sue. And I don't know if that was what brought you to do what you needed to do for your child, but I commend you for that.
Well, thank you. It's not a lawsuit, it's an investigation. I want to make that distinction.
Well, it can still get to that.
Yeah.
if need be.
Yeah, well, it could. Yes, and it's a difficult process to go through to get to that point. There was an enormous amount of effort and attempts at working with our local district to create and maintain a safe, affirming learning environment that ultimately, well, it left me where I was, and we had to file that complaint.
And is your child now in an outplacement or a private school?
No, thanks to the Resco Learning Alliance, we were able to find a magnet school. And my older one is also in a magnet school that is outstanding. Both are A+. A huge cloud is lifted from our house.
That is fantastic. But it just also shows that we need to do better so we don't have to shuffle our kids around.
No parent should have to try to go through what we did to find a school where my kids would learn. No one should.
Well, from one mama bear to another. Great work.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Linehan and Representative Kitt.
Thank you. I want to start by saying thank you for being such a strong advocate for your kids and for kids across the state who are vulnerable and facing similar issues, whether it be for race, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation. It's important that we all come together around this issue. You point out, you made a point that said, you know, that we have statutes in place. So for people asking why we're doing this task force, I think you just drove it home. We need to find out who's doing what and what's working and where we need to do more. If you could point to one thing that your child's new school is doing, is there anything in particular that you think is especially helpful or working?
So there's a couple of things that I've noticed. Number one, the school culture itself among the adults is very respectful, and clearly people are empowered to do their jobs. Everyone is. There's a lot of trust between everyone. That's one thing I've noticed. And then I'll just mention the second one is something that really stuck with me is the English teacher spent an entire unit on a book called Poet X. And I don't know if you know what that book is, but it is a book that features characters of color and queer characters in an entire unit. This was 2 months of working on this book, and part of those lessons included stepping into the shoes of the characters in the books and writing letters to legislators as those characters. And that just really resonated with me as a way to build the empathy that I talked about earlier.
Thank you. That's impressive. And I think you also mentioned representation in the faculty and in the curriculum. Is that something you could speak a little bit? I think you just gave us one example project, Poet X, but is that a theme that's carried throughout the curriculum and other disciplines?
I think so. This is our first semester. We just finished our first semester there in January, but there's not only is there a rainbow section in the library, but there's a lending library in the lobby of the school that was an Eagle project, actually, it's an Eagle Scout project. And it's a rainbow lending library. So there's that. There are queer educators and administrators within that school system. And people aren't hiding, and the last thing I'll mention that really struck me is the GSA at both schools, if I had to compare. The GSA at the old school was very much hidden. we didn't publish where the meetings were taking place because we didn't want other kids to come harass the kids, the GSA kids. The new school, they literally had a holiday party and the entire school was invited. There was no hiding. And it wasn't until I saw that happen that I realized that that's how a GSA is supposed to function versus let's hide you all away and not tell anybody where you are, rather than dealing with the actual issue at hand, which was the queer phobia and the daily harassment of those kids in the GSA.
Well, thank you so much, and good luck to you and your children.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on what you just said, was the unpacking of the GSA and the difference between the first school and the second school. And we know that some things thrive in darkness. And that is what we're trying to get to here, is we want to show more light because we need to create communities. We see it in social isolation. We see it in all these forms of hate speech and the ways that children are othered. We'd like to shine more light onto all of the things that you're talking about so that this creates a community that is truly a community.
Absolutely. And if I may, one of the issues is that data is not kept on LGBTQ plus students. We keep data on race and ethnicity, so there's already a lot of good information. More is needed. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but because LGBTQ plus data is not kept on students in schools, we need to be able to quantify the issue. And that way, by quantifying it, it better prepares us to deal with it in an appropriate and cost-efficient manner.
Representative Linehan for the second time.
I just want to add quickly, I asked what district you were in. And now that I know, I have to say that you have one of the greatest state reps. I'm one of his biggest fans.
Well,
So I needed to say that. I
he's
just
here in
want
the
to throw
room.
that in.
He's
There
here in
you
the
go.
room. So you're absolutely right. He's fantastic, and I'm extremely grateful. And it's always a pleasure to vote for him. Mike D'Amico.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Faith Sweeney. So seeing as Faith is not with us, we will move to end the meeting, and thank you all so much for your time.